Hi everyone, welcome back to our discussions on topics in pain. Today we're going to be talking about pain in the world or the global impact of pain. And so it's oftentimes very easy for us to start to focus on our own little niche in the world or how pain influences us from a country standpoint, whether it's the United States or Australia or in Europe. Wherever we live, with our focus and our attention and our view of pain is really shaped by the people we come in contact with, the things we read, as well as the education we had. And so it's really shaped by where we live. But really the question that we have is pain the same really around the world? And so today we're going to be diving into some discussions on how pain is around the world and to look to see if pain is really the same where we live versus other places in the world. So the overlying question that's going to be driving our discussions today is really, is pain the same everywhere around the world? You know, my kids are growing up now, and we don't get to go to Disneyland quite as often as we used to. We live probably about 5 to 10 miles away from Disneyland, and actually my clinic that I work at and own is really the closest clinic to Disneyland. And we'd oftentimes get overflow from Disneyland in terms of their workman's comp and things like that. But my kids, as needless to say, my kids, they've kind of grown up at Disneyland, and we spent a lot of time at there. And one of my favorite rides is actually the Small World. And I really enjoy the Small World because from a parent standpoint, it gives me a chance to go ahead and relax for a little bit in a place where the kids can't run around. But in addition to that, you know, Disneyland's Small World is really unique in that it's really a ride that focuses on the attributes of the world and how we're very much the same as opposed to different. You know, I remember going in, and one of the things that strikes me is really at the beginning, at the end of the ride, are signs that say welcome and that say goodbye at the end. And not only are they in English, but they're in all the different languages of the world. And so as we start to talk about pain, because pain is really a type of language, the language of the body. And so as we start to look at pain as a language of the body, the question really is pain the same regardless of what language you speak? No matter what your language, you probably have a different word for pain, but is it really describing the same thing? And is really pain the same all the way around the world? Because it's easy for us to think of pain from our own unique perspective and from our own unique experiences. And that's not only from an individual level, but also from a country level. And it really shapes our world's view of how we approach different things, and pain's included in that. Because in reality, while pain is uniquely individual, it is also an issue that has impact not only at our local levels, but also national and from global perspectives as well. You know, as we start to take a look at literature, and as literature starts to grow, really these advances in the research is really showing us and broadening our understanding of pain. And we really realize that pain is not just about the physiology and the biology, but really it's shaped and driven and influenced by so many other factors. And some of those factors are contextual, and some of them are social, and many of them are really non-biological. And so with these things in mind, it should come as no surprise that really pain, while functioning the same around the world as a protective mechanism, really may have uniquely different experiences depending on where you live. So the questions that we hope to answer in this module is, why is pain different in different parts of the world? And what parts of the world have the highest prevalence of pain? So first, is pain a universal experience? Well, we alluded to it a little bit in our discussion so far, because it is a small world after all. But is it plausible that pain, while a universal experience, may not be experienced the same in different parts of the world? So that's an interesting question. Is pain really the same whether you're in the United States, Australia, Africa, Russia, Asia, Europe? Is pain really the same everywhere? And is the prevalence the same everywhere? Looking at literature, we really know and we're really learning that pain is really a global problem. It is not isolated to one area of the world. That's not to say that the pain experience is the same everywhere in the world, but every place in the world does have pain. Pain is a global problem, and it's estimated that about 20% of the world population has chronic pain each year. Each year, about 1 out of 10 people are diagnosed with chronic pain, and globally, the 4 greatest causes of pain are really cancer, arthritis, surgery, and spinal pain. Pain is such a big problem that really the International Association for the Study of Pain has said that unrelieved pain is really a major global health problem. Now, what you'll see as we continue on with our talk a little bit, we'll start to take a look at this 20% of people in the world and say, are there areas of the world that are really different in that 20%, or is it really uniform across the whole globe, that 20%? And we'll also use spinal pain, really low back pain, as kind of a comparison point for pain around the world as well, because it is something that is researched fairly heavily, no matter whether in Europe, United States, Africa. So we have some good literature that takes a look at that, those stats. So let's take a look at the global chronic pain patterns. So if you start to take a look at pain around the world, while the percentages we talked about are really 20% if you average it around the world, you can see variations from country to country. And realize that these numbers are based off of research that's been done in a country. And so some places that you don't see research or don't see numbers doesn't mean that they don't have pain. It just means that they don't have research that we can use to kind of compare to other parts of the world. So if you look at the left United States, several studies have shown that chronic pain prevalence is probably about 30% in the United States. Well, how does that compare to other parts of the world? Well, if you look at the UK, it's fairly similar, about 28%, whereas Mexico is about 27%. So those are all fairly stable, around 30%. You look at Brazil, is about 37%, whereas India is about 13%, and China is upward of 40%. Now, we don't really know the reasons for this prevalence. All we're doing is stating the facts right now, or the stats. If we continue to dive into these numbers, if we look at the chart on the left, you'll see that the global prevalence of pain is about 10% in Israel and about 13% in India. So those are the low numbers, Israel and India. Australia is about 15%. UK is about 14%. And Japan about 15%. And you can start to see the numbers rise as you look at different areas. Now you could say that, well, these numbers are a little different than the numbers that we saw in the previous chart. Well, that's true. And you have to realize that depending on who you're looking at for cited literature and who you're looking at for the research and the studies that you're looking at, there's very commonly a little difference between the two. And so here, you'll see that still the high point is around China and South Africa at 42%. So there is no one single point of literature that studies all global pain patterns, and that's why you see the discrepancies in numbers a little bit, and that become a problem as you start to try and make your comparisons. And so it's just telling us that a lot more literature is needed for us to really get a grasp on global comparisons, because not one single source has looked at everything across the world. These are cuts and pieces of the literature that's out there. But if you do start to take a look at the literature is really describing a global pattern where chronic pain falls consistently between about 20 and 30% of the population. And there's multiple sources of literature that really says about 20 is the standard rate if you were to take one single number of the global prevalence of pain. But generally it compares between 20 and 30%. So really if a country's below 20%, they're doing pretty well. If a country's above 30%, then they're on the high side of the spectrum. So I said that one of the problems with looking at chronic pain in general, it's really drawing from a large sample of diagnoses. So when you look at chronic pain, it could be anywhere from fibromyalgia to chronic knee pain to low back pain to complex regional pain syndrome. And there's really no differentiation between chronic pain. If we start to narrow down the diagnoses to a single diagnosis like low back pain, we start to see patterns like you see on the chart on the right, where the red represents those areas with the highest prevalence of pain, of low back pain, and really those areas in which pain is the most common source of disability. Remember, we had said that there's 4 common sources of disability, or 4 common sources of pain, chronic pain, where we're looking at surgery, spinal pain, oncology. Well, of these are the areas where low back pain is the most common pain-related disability. So chronic pain is a subcategory in the study of research, and it focuses on one single area, one specific condition. And that's why we're using low back pain, because it's a place where we can use for comparison. So we see this pattern on the right. Studying low back pain gives us a way that we can start to have a common point of comparison. But if you look at the charts on the right, if you look at the map on the right, you'll start to see a pattern. And as we start to take a look at that pattern, it might lead you to question whether why is low back pain the most common thing in the northern hemisphere, but it doesn't seem to be quite as prevalent in the southern hemisphere? That's a great question, and I don't know if we really have an answer to it at this point. We see this pattern, but realize that also the research can be a little driven and a little skewed, because maybe in those areas that are in the southern hemisphere, there may be other factors beyond geography that might be driving this difference that we see between the northern and southern hemispheres. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper here. But before we do, we can also use one other common point of comparison, and that would be use of opioids. Now, opioids is a big problem in the United States, and so people often ask, is it also a big problem globally? Well, if you start to look at the global prevalence of opioid use, you'll start to see patterns that we see on that map on the right. The highest prevalence of opioid use is really the United States. You'll see there the continental and Alaska, in terms of the United States, really have the highest use of opioids. Canada has moderate use of opioids. Mild use of opioids we see in South America, and a moderate use also in Australia. But very minimal to mild use in most of Africa, most of Asia, most of Europe. So really, if we start to take a look at opioids are often used for the treatment of pain. And so it's first prescribed for pain, and then it gets out of control and people get addicted to it. So the global use of opioids and the fact that you see these patterns doesn't tell you that pain is higher in the United States. Really, it tells you that opioid use is higher in the United States. So really, if you start to look at the abuse and use of opioids and the opioid epidemic that's currently going on, really it's driven more in the United States than other regions, and that can be a factor that is not necessarily based off pain, but also off of pharmaceutical companies and access to the medications themselves. So, if we look at this north and south, remember that chart where north there's a higher prevalence of low back pain, and the southern hemisphere there was a lesser prevalence of low back pain. We said, well, maybe it's hemisphere, but there's other factors that might be a problem besides hemisphere. And a lot of those factors are what we call social determinants of health, and in this case, social determinants of pain. Now, you'll see, and we'll talk in later modules about social determinants of health, and we'll do a much deeper dive into it as we get into later modules. But today, it just as a starting point and a talking point. Really, pain and health are driven by other factors beyond physiology and biology. It's driven by other factors behind where we live and hemisphere. Although those are factors that drive some of this process. But if we look at the chart on the right, you'll see that things like agriculture and food, things like education, things like work environment and living and working conditions, employment status, water, sanitation, healthcare services, and housing all are huge factors in driving health, but also huge factors in driving pain. And when we see the split between northern and southern hemispheres in terms of low back pain, it may be an indication more about these social determinants of health than it is about the hemisphere in which they live. So things like geography, things like economics, things like access to health services, things like type of work you're doing are really things that influence someone's pain. So what do we take home? What are some clinical pearls? Well, really, no matter where you are in the world, no matter where you live, pain is a problem. It's a global problem. It's a problem so much so that the IASP have said that pain is really a global problem. How you manage it will likely depend on the regional factors that are still being defined. We don't know the regional factors that influence pain, and each region deals with pain and treats pain a little bit different. Now, is that something that's a factor in how people recover and the prevalence? Potentially. We just don't have enough information on it at this point. But those are things that we're learning. These are things that we're trying to drive in terms of research to look at the factors that might influence pain. Not only the physiology, but also the other factors that may be very influential as we start to take a look at this problem of pain. Take-home message: pain really is a global problem. The fact that pain is a global problem really should help us no matter what region you're in. It tells you that pain is something that we as humans have, that we're designed to have, but really there's other factors beyond the physiology, because the physiology of pain is fairly constant regardless of where you are in the world. And so that drives the fact that everybody has pain. But the rates, because they're a little different, a little lower in Israel, a little higher in China, in the middle lands, the US, the UK. So as we start to take a look at these different factors that influence pain, we realize that it goes beyond just the physiology. And the fact that pain is a global problem, but really has variations across the globe, should tell us that pain is much more than just a biological or physiological issue. It's influences by culture, by work, by sanitation, by stress, by so many other different factors. And this should give us hope as people who treat pain, because if we can address these different factors, then we can make an influence in someone's pain. So that's the end of today's module, taking a look at pain and its prevalence around the world. We'll see you next time.